Never saw the sun shining so bright, never saw things going so right, noticing the days hurrying by. When you're in love, my how they fly. Blue days, all of them gone, nothing but blue skies from now on.
Thank you for having me. My talk today is Sweetheart Wings. I'm wearing a pair right here. Flyboys and War Brides. Flyboys was a nickname for airmen, especially during World War II, and especially airmen in training. War brides were their brides that came from countries other than their own. So they were considered foreign nationals to the military, and so they were mixed nationality marriages. And as a result of that, the women crossed an ocean to be with the man they'd married. So I'll talk I found this pair of Sweetheart Wings, found out the name for it, at our local military museums right here in Calgary, and took this picture with my granddaughter Sarah a year or two ago. So I thought it would make a good title for this talk. So hence the Sweetheart Wings. This is a shot from my studio. I'm the daughter of a war bride and a military pilot. So it's in my family. I'm also a painter, and these are portraits on plywood that I've been doing for almost 20 years of war brides. This was a quick studio shot on my cell phone before the artwork, the paintings that you see here, went to a museum. They're currently on display at the Royal Air Force Museum in London, England. This was one of my quick shots before they went, and some of these women's stories I will tell you this afternoon. This is the reason I'm calling this talk Sweetheart Wings. It's elongated a wee bit, but this young woman's name was Kay Patterson at the time she married her Fleet Air Arm pilot. So he's a naval pilot. She's living in Portsmouth, England, which is on the very south coast, south of London, England. She's very young and very much in love. They've married, but one day she notices that he's given her a pair of Sweetheart Wings. Do you see them on the lapel? On the extreme right-hand side. Can you see those there? One day she lost them, and she was frantic. She told me this story as an older lady on the South Island of New Zealand when her life had taken a huge turn that she didn't foresee. She was frantic because she understood it was an omen. And she knew with the loss of the wings, there would be a telegram coming. Indeed, there was a telegram coming. Her young pilot had been killed in action. She found herself a 21-year-old widow with an infant child and no one left for her in England. She didn't know what to do, and she had her whole life ahead of her. So she turned her face to the sea and decided to make a one-way voyage to her husband's homeland. She'd never been there, but that's where they would have settled together had he lived, had he survived. So she needed the ocean voyage from England to New Zealand is 5 to 7 weeks at that time, a very, very long voyage. She didn't have a coat for the voyage, and in England everything was rationed. Food, clothing certainly, and even the fabric to make the clothing. It was very difficult. If she could afford to buy a coat, but she did not have the coupons. She couldn't do it without money and coupons. So being resourceful, she got a white woolen blanket, the common blanket of the day, took it to a seamstress, and had it made into a traveling coat that she could wear. She told me in Picton on the South Island of New Zealand, there wasn't even enough blanket fabric for a collar, but there was enough fabric for a tie belt to keep it tied. She didn't have the lining. lining was also rationed, especially as wedding dresses, because it was very much in demand. So she went to the undertaker, and she got coffin satin. And the young widow, with her little boy, set sail for a new life in her blanket coat with a coffin satin lining. And I painted her portrait based on the only photo, I didn't have this photo at the time, that she'd sent me. It's the second portrait in on the left. It's dark and a little hard for you to see, but I'll show you a close-up. And it wasn't a wedding picture as the others became, but it was the very first one on wood, because that story stayed with me. And there was something about it. It still is very compelling to me. So it became the first of almost 200 4-foot high by 1 foot wide portraits on plywood, painted by eye with oil paint, a big brush, and knowing each of the women as an older lady. So it was painted from a photo of her leaning back on the foreshore of New Zealand when she started her new life. And the story on silk that hangs beside each portrait, it's a little bit hard to read, tells that, it wouldn't be for a viewer, but it is on the screen here, tells her story in just a few sentences. There always was, I selected the piece of wood because it was a knot that you see. And it was a naturally occurring knot hole in this piece of plywood. I made it gold. There was never anything in the gold. For 16 years, it was just a gold knot hole that reminded me of a locket. Maybe his picture was going to be in it, maybe not. Just before the exhibition was shipped to London, I took a little wood burning kit and I burned tiny wings into it. For the sweetheart wings she lost a lifetime ago, and for her story, which started the other stories. So in a way, it was the first and the last that you see here. The museum, the Royal Air Force Museum in London, is a very large structure. And they wanted to tell the stories, many planes, vintage planes, aircraft, and then this quite unusual exhibition that's all women's stories on it. And the person who oversaw the exhibition wanted me to send some quotes. She did a fantastic job of taking just bits and making them very large on the wall. So what you're seeing is the stories on silk. This is one of the walls. The silk is for the wedding dresses, and it's a nice complement to the roughness of the plywood, but it's also for the silk scarves that the pilots wore. The sweetheart wings, by the way, are always pilots' wings, and all the airmen wore the uniform of their country. It didn't matter whether they were a cook for the Air Force or a trainee cook. They wore the Air Force uniform, rear gunner, navigator, all of them. The only ones with the double wings are the pilots. The air gunners had a single wing, navigators, etc. So the sweetheart wings are the paired wings, and they're the ones I burned into Kay's portrait. I'm putting this slide on now. We danced as if there was no tomorrow, because most war brides met their husbands at dances. So for the most part, they're in the war bride's country, stationed, training, recovering on active duty, whatever it is, and the young women are getting on with their lives or the war effort, as it may be, and they go to a dance, and that dance changed many, many lives. And dances were so important, especially in the war zone, to get away from the bombing, to get away from the later the B-1, the B-2 rockets that were coming over, the fear, the constant loss. And so dances were wonderful. And the Air Force themselves, the Red Cross, would host these big dances. And so I wanted to tell you just a little bit about these. So we danced as if there was no tomorrow. This is Eileen. Eileen was in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, WAAF. And this is the uniform she wore. She wore this uniform every day. days off, days at work, all the time. You'll see Irene as a young woman, and later beside her portrait at an exhibition here in Calgary at the Glenbow Museum. So she wrote, and I think this is really quite wonderful. I'll read it to you here. My hands are probably trembling. She said, to alleviate the boredom among the thousands of aircrew, huge hangars were converted into dance halls, and great bands were hired. Huge 10-ton lorries were sent to Gloucester and Cheltenham to pick up any girls who would like to come to a free dance with food served. That was a big attraction. Needless to say, the trucks were filled to overflowing. Thousands of girls were shipped in for these big band sounds and dances, all dressed in their best frocks, with bows in their hair, and looking very glamorous. We WAAFs didn't think we would stand a chance or get a look with all the glamour. So we took our time getting ready to attend. We did the best we could with our lisle stockings, heavy stockings, flat shoes, unflattering skirts, and uniform in general. So they're going dressed as they're working, and the others are all gussied up in new frocks. And it's that evening that Eileen meets an airman. He dances not once with her, but dances with her all night long. He goes back to his barracks and says to the other airman, I've just met the girl I'm going to marry. And indeed, he did marry her. And her story continues. I'll go on to the next slide. She's a wonderful woman. This is the portrait I did of her, and her story's along the side of it. But I'll tell it to you briefly because I think I'm a better storyteller than I am a reader. Her mother packed a ball gown for her. She was 19 years old, for her new life in the new country. Eileen finds herself in a little rented house in Bicycle, Alberta, largely German-speaking community of the day. She was considered an oddity. Her husband was hundreds of miles away on a training course to be a mechanic. He was gone all winter. She was alone. It was $10 a month to rent this little house. She had no running water. She would see people at church, but beyond that, she spent her time alone. It would get so cold at night that the plants froze and blackened. And at Christmas, he had 1 week off. He met her at the bus depot in Calgary, and he saw her. By then, she was pregnant. She was 19. Her thin English tweed coat with buttons popping at the bus station. He realized that it wouldn't cope with the Canadian winter and her being alone. So he took all the money he had made from selling his first car, and he marched her off to the Hudson Bay Company, and he bought her the finest flank muscat fur coat that he could afford. And she wore that coat. She loved that coat. It was a gift of love, but at night she put it over the bed to keep her warm and in the unheated night, and she wore it to town, and she was cozy and warm in that coat. But she said to me when she saw the portrait, she said, I know why you chose that piece of wood. And I looked at her, and I wasn't sure I did, although I do try and choose the wood to match the story, like the knothole. And she said, I counted the knots. There's 9 of them. She said that first winter that I was so lonely and alone, I was pregnant with the first of my 9 children. So that was Eileen. I have some more pictures. This is her, beside her portrait. You can see it here in Calgary at the Glenbow Museum. Her in uniform, very proudly in uniform. And the editor of the little magazine called the Wakefield Kinsman wrote to me and said, I wasn't aware of this photograph, but you made someone very happy. She said, imagine a 90-year-old cover girl. So there's Eileen. The second portrait is Margaret Kirk at the day, and this is the overseas wedding announcement. Margaret was in the Women's Land Army, so you see the Land Army uniform. Many of the women, especially in the UK, were in the services or the war effort supporting it. She was in the Land Army. She drove a Fordson tractor and worked with Italian and German prisoners of war, driving her Fordson tractor and collecting potatoes. So she was a feisty little Yorkshire lass whom I knew very well, and I didn't know that her story was a tough story, though. And she wrote that, I thought this was very good too. She said, the Air Force was stationed close to us, and they were training to fly Wellington bombers before flying over Germany and Lancaster bombers. The American Air Force flew daytime raids over Germany and fortress bombers. The British, Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand boys flew together on night raids. One Saturday evening, two of my friends asked me to go with them to a dance at the Air Force base. She rode over on her bicycle. That fateful Saturday night changed my life forever. Margaret went on to say her husband said he'd take her away from all of this. And he did take her away from all of this. After crossing an ocean, I was during the war as well, and there were U-boats in the Halifax Harbor area, submarines. It's one of the only boats that I know, the Nihalis, who came in through Montreal. So she's a war bride who did not come through Pier 21, but came ahead down the St. Lawrence and into Montreal as a war bride. So after crossing the Atlantic in wartime conditions and seasickness, the women always traveled on their own, as groups of women, not with their husbands. She then took the train to Medicine Hat, Alberta, and was met by her husband's family, who took her 60 miles to Manyberries, Alberta. So he did take her away from all of this. He took her away from electric lights, from running water, from an indoor bathroom, from cement sidewalks, and from paved roads. And it was a shock for her, but she got on with things, had 4 children, but unfortunately alcohol was a problem. Her husband had been a rear gunner. She said he was a very talented man who could do anything, but PTSD, the war, other circumstances, they were in a very dire situation, and she didn't let her family at home know. So friends and neighbors realized this was becoming very bad for Margaret, and her brother sent money to bring her home, and she went home to England with her 4 children, but the children said to her, "Mom, this isn't home for us. We want to go home." So she came back to Canada, raised the children alone. I met her in her later years, a wonderful woman who had remarried later on. Her husband did succumb to alcohol. It was a tragic situation, but she was a feisty little war bride. We knew her as Little Margaret, and her spirit was wonderful, and I'm just pleased to have known her when I did. Not all war brides met at dances. I'm going to be talking about the portrait that's the third in from the right as you see it on the screen. This is a war bride who's now living in Edmonton, Alberta. She's well into her 90s. And it's a portrait of her in her home in Edmonton with the portrait. And I really, really liked Dorothy Lincoln's story. Dorothy was one of Winston Churchill's geese that laid the golden egg but never cackled. She worked at Bletchley Park on the Enigma machines, in shifts of 3. So it was going 24 hours a day, very highly secret. She couldn't tell anybody about it for 30 years, including her own father. So she worked always on these machines. She met a navigator. She was skilled with numbers and as a navigator, so was he. He was also a concert pianist. He came from the village of Toulon, Manitoba. Who would have known that there was a trained concert pianist in a village of about 200 people in Manitoba? But he was an only son. He was good on piano, and there was a war bride from the First World War there, as far as I know the First World War, but a war bride lived there, and as he was growing up, she had taught him how to play the piano. He was very gifted on the piano, so he was a navigator during the war. His back was hurt when his plane was limped in. They thought it would crash land, but it made the English coast. They all hunkered down to survive the crash. They all did. He stood up, the plane dropped out of the trees, and his back was quite badly hurt. However, he took further training in London and in Paris, and she now lives in Edmonton, but he was for a long time with the University of Alberta in the music program there. But he was on the radio across Canada, so he was a trained concert pianist. And she was on the Enigma machines. Hazel, who I've known for a long time and I greatly respect, as I do all war brides, met on a blind date. She didn't want to go on the blind date, and she said to her friend, "No, I really don't want to. What if I don't like him? It's going to be a really long evening." And her friend said, "Oh, come on, I can't go if you don't go." And so she said it's an airman. She knew that. Hazel said, on the way there, she thought, what if I do like him? Well, she said she was met by this 6-foot-tall, handsome man, immaculate uniform, brown leather gloves. She said, I don't recall what the other chap looked like. And she was absolutely in love. It might have been a blind date, but Hazel wasn't blind and she was in love with Russell. And but she was very much a Londoner. She was training in the ballet. She loved everything about London. She found herself on the boat and then the very long train ride across Canada. The porter says to her, "Dear, where are you going?" And she said, "I'm going to Raymond, Alberta." And he looked at her and he said, "Do you know you're going to have to get your groceries by canoe?" Not by canoe, she believed him, I think. Anyway, he was teasing her. And but she was not prepared for Raymond, Alberta. Raymond, Alberta was not prepared for Hazel West either. But it was a love story, a fine love story that continues to this day. And this is at the Glenbow Museum. Hazel's beside her portrait. These are the girls in her family. They're her daughters, and one granddaughter who's in university there. And her stories are wonderful, but Hazel described it best that I've ever heard, and it's something I've experienced, so I know what it feels like. Hazel said, we all knew what we were doing, marrying these other nationalities. She said we knew it. When we were getting married, we knew it, but we didn't know it. And she said it wasn't until we were on the deck of the ship. And she said the ship is so huge and you're looking down on the land. And she said the ship starts to pull away. And she said in that moment, she said a shudder went through every one of us. There were hundreds on her ship. Sometimes there were thousands on some of the big ships. And she said in that moment, we all knew what we'd done. All were on a one-way passage paid by the government. No way home. It's post-depression, post-war. There's no money for a two-way passage if you don't like it, if he's not there at the station platform, if mother-in-law doesn't like you. And most had to live with mother-in-law for at least 6 months, because, if not longer, because of the post-war shortage of building materials. Sheila lives in Red Deer, and here she is in her South African Women's Air Force uniform. So she's in the South African Women's Auxiliary Air Force, and she takes a posting to Egypt. It's a 2 Kanzim posting, meaning those are very strong desert winds that come in once a year. So she took a 2-year posting to Egypt in Cairo. They didn't know she was still a teenager, and apparently she had to be of age to do it, but she managed and did well, and she signed up for a second 2-year posting. On the second 2-year posting, she met a Canadian Spitfire pilot serving in the only Middle Eastern squadron for the Canadian RCAF. There they are on their wedding day. He had to apply for military permission to get married, as did all the airmen. It slowed things down. The military didn't want their soldiers or airmen or Navy for that matter marrying while on active duty, because it caused a huge logistical nightmare after the fact. So they slowed things down as much as they could, but they could not expressly forbid it. So here she is with her pilot. She had to apply for military permission to marry as well. She also had to apply for military permission to wear civilian clothes in Cairo Cathedral on her wedding day. She had no civilian clothes because women in the forces, that's all they wore, was the uniform. They didn't have rations for anything else. So her dress was made by her brother's wife, seamstress, and sent to her, guessing her size, and it fit very well. She was thrilled, actually. So there's her story on silk, which is essentially what I've told you there. They were married in Cairo Cathedral, and after the war, she followed him at that time to Edmonton. Mother-in-law did not like her daughter-in-law. She burned all her clothing. All her clothing was nothing. So on the story on silk, I put 2 burn marks. I took it outside. I wasn't sure whether it would waft and be gone, with a barbecue lighter, and thought, well, I'll try. I need a couple little burn marks. But Sheila was so welcomed to Edmonton in the day that her clothing was all burned. Sheila's now living in Red Deer. Fantastic memory. These stories are still coming to me. Some of these are very recent portraits. So I think it's very important to remember and acknowledge and celebrate all these stories. Now I want to turn the tables and take it to the air training plan in Canada. Canada was one of the greatest of Canada's war efforts was the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, hosting it in all across Canada. This photo is of a very small group of women leaving Calgary as war brides, of aircrew training in Calgary and vicinity. So they're women who live in Calgary, they're Canadian, but the airmen are Australians and New Zealanders and English and Scottish. Some are Norwegians or Free French. And they're going to dances too, here, only the dances are here. And the same thing is happening here, but in far smaller numbers in terms of the war brides. So this is a picture taken somewhere near the Palliser Hotel, official photo, RCAF, of some local young women on their way to New Zealand, with the one right up at the back, Marjorie Marsh, who was in Calgary going to Australia. Her friend said, oh, come on, you can get in. We're New Zealanders, but come on. So she popped in and they gave her the photo. And what did all these airmen, about 130,000 were trained across Canada. They trained all the different, you'll notice the airmen in uniform on skis. I call this Kiwis on skis. It's actually a family photo. You won't find it anywhere else. Most of these photos are from private albums. And so the stories that are being told aren't something, you know, in a broader context. But you'll notice most of the airmen wearing one wing because they're navigators, they're rear gunners, they're wireless radio operators, they're other things. I'll come back to this photo. And as I say, uniforms all the time, even on the honeymoon. And here are some women. These women are on their way to, I think these ones are on their way to Australia. They're on the deck of a ship. a photographer comes aboard. The women spontaneously link arms. They don't necessarily know each other. They're all Canadians. They're from all across the country. And as the ship's going under the San Francisco Bay Bridge, the women come together. And I love that photo. I had it for quite a while, wondering what to do with it. There were about 4,000 war brides who left Canada going to other countries. This is what I did do with it. It's a little hard to see. It's a single piece of steel wire. It's continuous, and it's about 10 feet long. Each of the figures is quite large, over 4 feet, and it's made as one piece. It was a very difficult thing. I had no idea what I was embarking on when I started it. And I realized very soon that if you took wire in a direction, you either had to keep it going or take it back. And you couldn't just keep going back and forth to finish. So what I did is the reason it's one single unbroken piece of heavy wire that was very hard for me to bend by hand was that I wanted the women to have a connection. They didn't have it when they arrived. They didn't have it when they left. But for that little time on the ship, they did. And in later life, they came together. But the reality was many came to farms in small areas and maybe didn't even know another war bride. They had no sort of community of support. I wanted to give them shoulder to shoulder here. So this, I'll go back one more time. It's hard to see, but it is a very large piece. And very unwieldy. I love it. There's 2 infants in it too.
Where is it?
It's in my studio between big pieces of cardboard, taking up a whole wall. It may have gone to London if I offered it as part of the show, but it didn't relate specifically to the UK, and besides, I didn't know how to ship it. It's very lightweight. That's the only good thing about it. I can easily manage it. So I came back to this piece for a family reason. The pilot in the center and the little inset is my father. He's 20 years old at the time. Most of them were about that age. There was a dance, a New Year's dance at the hangars. So similar to Eileen, only a different country. This is my mother. In this wedding photo, my father had been 1 week 21, 1 week of legal age. And my mother, so the photographs taken in June 16th, 1944. My mother in December 1946, 2 days before Christmas, is on the Wanganella, the ship. It was nicknamed bride ships. There were ships full of brides, crisscrossed the globe in 1946. One of the last bride ships bound for New Zealand. So my mother's like queuing up with some of the other war brides going to join in just before she got off. And part of the reason I worked on this for almost 20 years and that these stories still give me goosebumps is my mother never really told me her story in her own words and by her own lips. I know it basically, and in the end it did not work out. That's the reason I have a Canadian accent. I did live 9 years on the North Island of New Zealand, and I still feel very connected to that land as well as this land. But in my family, they are both home, and so I feel I'm both. This one, I like this story. Anne Ungarian was her name. She's from Smoky Lake, Alberta, from a Ukrainian family. In Edmonton, she met an airman. She's not married in Canada. That's why he's not in uniform. The men were always in uniform. She came as a fiancée on the same ship as my mother, the Wanganella, in 1946. She had only so many days to marry him because the condition of one-way passage by the government was that they'd be married within a number of days, less than a month. And so he's married in civilian clothes after she arrives after the war in New Zealand. The irony is that this young woman from from northern Alberta is buried in one of the southernmost cities on the globe, Invercargill, New Zealand. She spent her life in New Zealand, and a niece said when she came back to Smoky Lake, Alberta, she said she'd never met anyone who could speak Ukrainian with a Kiwi accent. Anne became a well-known hat maker, one of the reasons I love hats. And so Anne was happy in that life choice, but it was just amazing the way her journey took her.
Is that you? And it looks like you.
No, I'll go back to that. That's Anne and her sister in the street photos you would see of the day in Edmonton. Anne and her husband in New Zealand, they were married in New Zealand, and the painting, there's a little elongation happening with all of these that I'm not seeing here, but it's just the way it formats. So if you can realize that everybody's not this wide on there, it's just, no, it's not me. It's another Anne Igaria. And I've got a few more stories and I'll wind it up. This is Thomasina, who goes to her fortune teller. She's from Drumheller, very young, a teenager. And the fortune teller, because you never know what's going to happen in the war, and I think she really was curious. Fortune teller said, you're going to change jobs and you're going to meet the man you're going to marry. And her friend said, there's jobs on the flight lines of De Winton. So the air training place in De Winton, Alberta was being set up. Thomasina was 16 or 17. She was young. And she said they got no training, but she found herself on the flight lines as a civilian employee. So this is her. In your mind's eye, make these planes mustard yellow. That was the color of the thousands of training planes across the prairies especially, but across the whole of Canada. So some of what she has to do, I'll see if I have it here. She writes that Robert, her husband, was a flying officer in the Royal Air Force. He was an instructor. My job was with a civilian company that operated the air station, number 37 EFTS, De Winton, Alberta, fueling the aircraft, taking the chocks away from the wheels, applying the booster if the engine didn't turn over. The first time he asked for a booster, I didn't know what he meant. Poor guy had to unstrap and boost his own plane. We didn't receive any formal training, just learned on the job. Another nice job was helping the pilots buckle in. We also had to wash the planes and work at night shifts for the night flying and use flashlights to guide the planes to a parking area. Rather frightening with the props still going round in front. I often wondered if they would stop. I helped Bob often, as the other girls knew I liked him. So I like their own words. 17. He's not of legal age yet, but he's a pilot training other pilots. And he's 20. He has to apply for permission to marry, and he's underage. He is leaving to see active duty, and he's engaged to Thomasina. I knew her as Thomasina, but she went by Ina. Mother said, no, that's not going to happen. I think you can see Mother in this photo. She said, you are going to marry my daughter, or you're going to break it off. She said, you're not just going to go and engage to her. Thomasina started to cry. She said she was crying out of embarrassment. She told me this. But Robert, being very good-hearted, thought her heart was breaking and said, fine, we'll get married. So there they are. Mother held great sway. So the photo, I wouldn't have that photo of the couple kissing on their honeymoon if it wasn't for the fact that the family didn't go with them on the honeymoon. They could have the family car, but they took Mom, Dad, and younger brother along. And stayed where Mom wanted her to stay. So anyway, Mother was a force to be reckoned with. Not only mothers-in-law, but mothers too. And on the good side of things, the photo on the right is a projection that I projected onto a little wing flap from a plane. I won't tell you where I found the wing flap, because it made me wonder where the rest of the plane was. Actually, I found it at a charity shop, as they say in England, a thrift store. And I thought, I don't know what I'm going to do with this flap, but I knew something would come of it. So I took a projector and I projected the photo of them kissing onto the flap, and the riveting runs down and seems to rivet them together. I really, really like that. And her portrait on plywood, you can see the graining follows the neck. It provides sort of, I try and pick for the grain of the wood to follow the contour. So her portrait is the one on the left, a loaf of bread, a bottle of wine, and thou. So you're getting to see the exhibition here, but you're getting to hear some stories as well. This one, did you hear this singing when you first came in? Yeah. Okay, this relates to this war bride. There was a huge flying training school in Calgary, and Phyllis has 2 L's in it. A friend of hers said, you have 2 L's, Phyllis, for your 2 loves. So she's a Calgarian. This is her first love. It's her fiancé as well. He was a New Zealander training here in Calgary. She got word that he had been killed setting flares in Northern Ireland, off Northern Ireland, and so was killed when he'd been stationed overseas on maneuvers. And, you know, her heart was broken. She's a young woman. She's in a lineup for the pictures with her girlfriend, the movies, the theater, one of these theaters in Calgary. I don't know which theater. And someone offers her some lollies. He's an Australian. He's an airman too. She's bound to marry an airman. This is the 2nd L in her name. And you heard Bill Davis. He's in his tiger moth there singing here. They went to the movies, not together. They came out after the movies. On the sidewalk, he serenaded her. He has a magnificent singing voice. He would sing for the troops. But he was also a badly damaged man. He'd been in the Australian Army in New Guinea, and he had seen things he should never have seen. But Phyllis followed him to Australia. She was on an aircraft carrier with all sorts of other war brides, and she was a fiancée. She had just a certain length of time, less than a month, to marry, and her story came to me from her daughter and also the tape of her father singing. So I thought it was a good way. He had a beautiful voice. Phyllis said he looked like a prize fighter and sung like an angel. She fell in love first with his voice. This is the size of some of the bombers. This is a Sterling bomber. We know Lancasters. There's a Lancaster in Mountain. And this is the last of the stories I'll tell you. No part of it really relates to Calgary. I've made this talk just for this audience, for this place at this time. And, but this one does touch Calgary just a little, and I think in a rather profound way. The story, this is a woman's book. It's called Journey to Joy. It's the memoir of a war bride. Her current name is Betty Cranmer. I read about her story in a magazine, a newsletter for American war brides. I paint all nationalities of war brides. I always have, and I always will. So this was her as a nurse. And I'll tell you the story of how she met her husband. She was an RAF, in the RAF as a nurse in a hospital in England. And it was a hospital particularly for burned airmen that they had very new procedures of grafting and trying to lessen some of the horrors of war, really, as it was war in the air. And she met her husband. He was in a saline bath. And all he could see of her was 2 very blue eyes. She was fully gowned. She had to be. And his story was that he was an American airman. Before the war, before Pearl Harbor, he knew he had to do his bit. He came up to Calgary and he trained here in Calgary. And he earned his wings and he went off to active duty. And he was on active duty when the plane developed problems. 4 of them survived the crash. And there was a dinghy they were able to get to in the North Sea, but the rations were contaminated with petrol, and so was the water. They had 1 small canteen between 4 of them. This is the North Sea. This is exposure. And you'd think that narrow body of water, they could be seen. They were not seen. The first airman drank seawater, and he died and was put over the dinghy. Second and third, same thing. The final airman was hallucinating. He was very, very near death, and a seagull landed on his chest. He didn't even really know at the time what happened, and he finally realized that this is the only thing. He was amazed at this life, but he killed the seagull to survive. The next day, 14 days later, he was picked up, and it was a friendly aircraft. He was taken to this hospital because his exposure and his feet were in such bad shape when they took his boots off. So they were trying very, very hard to save his legs and his feet. And so he was in the bath for skin grafts to his feet. It did not work. He lost both lower legs below the knee. But over time and the convalescing and trying to save them, a love affair developed. And she would wheel him down to the pictures in his wheelchair. And she wrote this book. So there you see her airman. His name was really Frederick Malcolm Mann. But the nurses at this hospital said, "You don't look like Frederick Malcolm, you look like Henry Fonda." He was a very good looking man. So they called him Henry. So it was Henry. So Henry fell in love. Henry and Betty fell in love. It's hard to see, but that's the wheelchair. And the nurses helped them with the wheelchairs and took them places a little bit. The second one, which is also hard to see, is him retraining on Spitfires. He's lost his lower legs, but he can fly fighters because no one else is responsible. In a bomber, you have a whole crew responsible for your flying. In a fighter plane, you do not. So he's training on Spitfires. It's truly a love story. And he asks her to marry him. She agrees. He said, "I won't marry you till I can walk down the aisle." So on prosthetic limbs, he walks down the aisle. This is her, this is the painting. I did it mostly from the cover of the book, her book, because she's in her 90s, living near Denver, Colorado, and said, "It's just too difficult, dear. If you can get my book, work from the photos and that." So that's what I did. I've talked to her on the phone several times. She really likes the portrait. So it's based partly on the nurse's uniform, which is part of the story, but her own wedding photo was like it, but very small in the book and hard to see. However, I kept, and you'll see it on the one in the right-hand side, she became very religious in her later life, but on the nurse's uniform is a cross. So I used little pins and pricked kind of hammered the cross into it. So it's her as a bride and as a nurse. She was married because, actually I brought the book, it's called Journey to Joy. My son got it online for me. She told me about it. But she said, in wartime, by necessity, weddings were creative affairs. Young couples made do with very little. My dress was lovingly made by one of my dear aunts, a wonderful seamstress, who pieced it together from the lace of an old tablecloth. We had no coupons to buy clothing. Civilians got coupons, but military personnel, and she was military, were provided only their uniforms. So to get a white wedding was virtually impossible or very difficult. So hence the white tablecloth. So I took a piece of an old tablecloth and I used it as a stencil. And I took my brush with the white paint. I don't know if you can see it, but the patterning on the sleeve is really a little bit of that. So these are my insider things that I like to do for myself for it. But anyway, this is the story that started in Calgary with his training. This is at the Royal Air Force Museum, where the exhibition is until next September. And this is not part of the exhibition. This is another part of the museum, because it used to be an old aerodrome during the war. And this is their memorial window. But I thought it was fitting, because for the rest of the story, 2 years after the couple were married, the war was still on. He was still training to fly Spitfires. He woke up suddenly and died later that day, very, very suddenly. And it was among the blackest times of her life. She was pregnant with a child and had a small child, and she had no one there. She came to his family in the United States. And she's a strong woman. Her faith got her through, and she remarried. She always wanted a large family, and she had a large family. So she welcomed me to tell her story. She just couldn't help me with the photos. So, and these are tear bottles. They're tiny. They're for the tears that War Bride shed. Tears of joy, tears of loss, tears of homesickness and sorrow. There was only one side of a family for war brides, at least in all the early years. Same with my early childhood. I only knew, and the mothers always spoke with an accent and seemed sort of exotic or strange. War bride children also always experienced the same things. So these are the tear bottles in the display in London, being carefully set up by Angela Vinci, who oversaw the curation of the exhibition, and one of the assistants. And to bring it right back to place and to finish, I have 3 slides. This is the color of the planes, the thousands of trainers that were, they really were scrolling through Canadian skies. Scotty's the airman. He was trained in Eastern Canada. That's the color, kind of mustard yellow color of the plane. That's a whole other story. I won't go into that. This is what the prairie looked like after the war. Less so as time goes on, but there were very, very many fuselages around. This is a memorial dedicated to the memory of airmen just from Australia and New Zealand killed in training in Canada. Only in training, only in Canada. Almost 200 didn't even make it past training. Planes would land on top of planes, would hit wires. These were young men training. And the inset is a couple. He's one of the ones on that list. So this is by the Memorial Park Library. It's and all sides have names on it. This is not the English. This is not the other nationalities. This is Keith Harder, south of High River. He wanted to do his own tribute to airmen. I think it's magnificent from the ground. It looks like the photo on the lower right. So if you drive up to the field where it is, it sort of looks like parts of planes there. But seen from the air, I think Keith and I are both, in our ways, making tributes to the gallant men who graced our skies in the 1940s, whether they're Canadian skies, skies over the war zones in Europe, wherever they trained and fought, and the loves of their lives, and their memories and their offspring. This is meant to be a tribute to all in this talk. It's called Graffitas. All it is the discarded fuselages of some of the training planes. He's brought them together using gravel and I think weed killer and whatnot. He traced out in, I think, tarpaulin, the size, original size of these planes, because there's only bits of them left. I think he did it in a curling rink or a big facility with his family, and then used it as a template, bringing all these planes facing center and sort of honing into a center. And it looks like this sometimes in the summer, but he has to keep the weeds down, otherwise it just gets grown over the way the fuselages and parts of the trainers do. But in this talk, and I just received a book from someone I know in England, it's called Under an English Heaven, and written as a little note to me, I thought it was fantastic and it was really wonderful. He says it's a war bride story, but it's also the story of those gallant men, these are his words, who graced our skies in 1943. He remembers them, he's older than I am, under an English heaven, I would say under a Canadian heaven as well, and all the young airmen who trained here. So thank you, and all their war brides. Thank you very much.